What are you?
I am the Guardian of Forever.
My name is Zachary Conan. I'm here with David. If you enjoy this video, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Today we are talking about one of the most beloved Star Trek episodes ever, and beyond that, it's considered one of the greatest episodes of television ever. We're talking about episode number 28 of the first season of the original series of Star Trek, The City on the Edge of Forever, written famously by Harlan Ellison and then infamously rewritten by Gene Roddenberry himself. And this is one of Gene's 3 favorite Star Trek episodes. I believe he loves The Menagerie, and he loves Where No Man Has Gone Before and The City on the Edge of Forever, and depending on which interview you read, he most often cites this one as his absolute favorite. And this episode, I almost feel like I'm talking about the stuff of myth here. I'm sure you know it, but just very quickly, it's essentially a time travel-based tragedy, a romantic tragedy, where Kirk is forced to allow a woman that he loves to die and prevent his friend from saving her life in order to right the differences in time that occurred in it. And then that's the basic premise of it. David, what did you think of this episode?
This episode was amazing. I was blown away by the sophistication involved in what was being discussed, the many different layers. But before I get into any of those layers, I did want to get into a little bit of a backstory behind The City on the Edge of Forever, particularly that Ellison is a science fiction writer that I am familiar with in other works, particularly in I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, which is a video game RPG kind of thing that deals with totalitarianism, but then also with his contributions to The Outer Limits as well. And Ellison's name in this particular analysis is not going to be understated. His contributions were a multitude, not only because the script for this particular episode was rewritten several times and passed through several hands, particularly twice with Gene Roddenberry, and there were differences in the alternatives, but also
Gene Kuhn also, I think, wrote a...
Gene Kuhn also
It took 10 months to write this script, from what I've read.
Yeah, exactly. And throughout those 10 months, there were a lot of arguments into trying to keep it short, but also keep it potent, and then the different elements in which should be kept while other elements being removed. At one point, Gene Kuhn, his particular contributions to rewriting the script was criticized by Leonard Nimoy as basically taking a chainsaw to the script itself and destroying Ellison's impact in the script. And so a lot of the producers, particularly Gene Roddenberry, went out of his way to say, you must include Ellison's contributions to this particular episode, because removing him almost entirely from it actually destroys some of the magic that was given through Ellison. And so I wanted to get further into just what this story is about. First, I wanted to talk about how the initial plot came with the problem of them, the Enterprise, going through time waves. And it is a MacGuffin. It is a MacGuffin that the Guardians of Forever are not more divulged, but that decision-making process was taken out of the equation, and instead we are left with an entity that has a portal. And that's part of the mysteriousness of it, is that we have no explanation as to who the Guardians of Forever are and why they're there, and particularly why they're interacting with the Enterprise humans and, of course, with all of the history of humanity, right? But what's interesting about it is a lot of the inspiration for the adrenaline shot that was accidentally injected into McCoy in the very beginning of the episode was actually Ellison's inspiration from an earlier version. And the earlier version was talking about how military ships in general have a de facto crew that is criminally minded. And so that was a bit controversial, and that's why that was the illegal drug trade was an original version by Ellison, but that was discarded, and instead it was put more in the lens of an accident. And that accident did, in fact, add to the story. It added to the plot that instead of focusing on this particular element of
But I think that
drugs,
morbid truthfulness or irony is still there because they have that kind of powerful drug, and accidents can happen. And I think it's kind of eerie that the first thing Bones does is scream in Spock and Kirk's faces that they are murderers and assassins.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what they become at the end of the episode. They are murderers and assassins going out of their way to ensure the death of a perfectly innocent young woman.
And that's amazing to it because it was almost like they knew that that element was going to continue to be there because of the fact that there was an adrenaline shot being, 50 times more potent than what was supposed to be administered, right? And so that was pretty amazing that they were able to still carry that metaphor and not leave out any of the originality of that particular idea being injected into
It's injected in, and I think that Bones is wonderful. There's something, to me, really sad and interesting about the Doctor from the future breaking down in an alley in the 1930s, crying about, like, sutures and, like, bandages and, like, cutting people open in hospitals. It was a fascinating choice to have him say certain things, but especially murderers and assassins, because that is ironically and tragically and morbidly what this crew becomes, what Kirk and Spock have to do.
Mm-hmm. And so this is carried forward with the whole situation being caught up in this sort of temporal time loop. It's a lot like this is very consistent with Star Trek's interpretations of time and space being inseparable, and that there's this sort of Mobius strip where the events of the past alter the events of the future, and therefore it kind of has this grandfather's paradox. And that grandfather's paradox, it was addressed in other science fiction series like The Twilight Zone, but the way it is uniquely done here in Star Trek in the episode The City on the Edge of Forever is beautiful because what they do is they take the idea and they bring it to a head where even Nazis are mentioned eventually down the line later on in the series, and not to like jump around, but to just like really crystallize how important it is that totalitarianism is discussed in relation to time, in particular in relation to human history and how humans have evolved. And remember that this is taking place way, way, way into the future, into the 24th century, and how humans have evolved past that, right? And in other versions of this particular story, they had an idea for an evil enterprise that was wanting to destroy all of them.
Which they follow through on a mirror in the second season.
Yeah.
Another perfect episode, which we will talk about eventually one day. But that was one of the ideas, yeah. And you brought up Nazis. This is the first time Nazis were ever mentioned in Star Trek.
Yeah.
As well. It's the first time Roddenberry or anyone involved made totalitarianism real in our own physical memory. And used it as a consequence.
And what's interesting about Ellison versus Roddenberry is how Ellison was very much a cynical and jaded science fiction writer, because he was he actually went on record to say that the dialogue version contributed by Roddenberry was precisely the kind of dopey utopian bullshit that Roddenberry loved. End quote. And what I find
he's
interesting...
not incorrect, but like what's interesting about that is that he has the woman parroting these lines, Edith parroting these utopian values. That's Roddenberry's own at his dreamiest, at his most unrealistic, at his most utopian, correct? But he has this woman saying them who is tragically doomed to die, like she has to die. So I think it's not just fluffy, empty points. It's it's interesting that Roddenberry has the woman who is saying them forced to be killed because she is an agent of peace in the wrong time. And I feel like Roddenberry is almost saying that about himself. I think he has a self-awareness as well. I think it's a bit more complicated, you know?
Yeah. And it is more complicated, and I'm glad that Ellison had a significant impact in this particular episode, because you do see little still shots when Spock's trying to develop that little radio broadcaster to see into future events. Another MacGuffin, which you shouldn't pay too much focus to, and the plausibility of it, because it takes away from the ability of the plot to move forward, particularly with Spock's contribution as a character to be analytical and to really just point out the evidence and what's at stake.
And this is a tight 50-minute episode. Like, we have to forgive all matters of convenience, of them ending up at the same exact place, of them ending up in a mission, of them meeting Edith right away. We have to forgive all of those. It's a very tight 50 minutes, and the point of the script is to make you feel the tragedy, is to make you experience it as Kirk does. We've talked on this channel about how Kirk is a very interesting character in the idea of how he experiences things, and how it's about the phenomena of experience. And I think that that's a concept that is carried over from certain episodes like this, where we see him have... We talked about this on the motion picture analysis, and you'll see a link for it right now. You click on that, we go into it in depth there because it's explored much more fully in that kind of motion picture format. But here, it's really interesting because he has to do the visceral experience, right? He has to have that visceral experience. And then what's the most heroic thing about Kirk is how he handles and digests and moves past these experiences. And you see him maybe at his weakest in the entire show at the end, like obviously visibly affected by this, and all he could say is, let's get the hell out of here. But it's all about the experience and the reflective at the end. It's only that I don't think that Kirk can make anything right out of the reflection of this, because it's not a triumph for him anymore. But that's what makes him interesting as a captain, is how he digests experiences through the phenomenological perspective.
Absolutely, and I agree. And Kirk's contribution here is really impacting in his choices thereafter, especially when you find out that Kirk falls in love with Edith. And that further complicates the entire situation and adds a theatrical element that Ellison was lacking as a writer. Because Ellison, he's more of an author, he's more of a writer, he's not a series or a TV producer or a film producer. But Ellison did, in fact, write this with the detail and idea of it being kind of a standalone film, almost. And the reason why he did that is because he wanted his legacy really to be added to the Star Trek ethos. Perhaps that was.
He's been the one who's been he accepted all those Hugo Awards and things like that, even though arguably Gene Roddenberry owes as much of a claim to them.
Right. And Ellison's contribution here is in the detailed sophistication and the knowledge brought about from the 1930s. Ellison was quoted by Roddenberry of having a very detailed knowledge of what was happening in the 1930s, which made this particular story stand out for me, because I am also very well knowledged in the Great Depression, especially in America, and the fact that the United States was in fact in cooperation with Nazi Germany, and having this sort of like this backdrop discussion, and then that is subtly injected into this particular TV episode. In the original series, it goes on to show about what major events are happening through headline newsreels and actual newspapers being given to Kirk, being given to McCoy, and also being seen by Spock. And so the fact that Ellison knew about all of what was happening was even more poignant to the point that that was brought up later on, as to why it was so important that Edith had to die an accidental and tragic death, and rather than her go on to live. Because was it Spock who said that she had the right idea, but it was in the wrong time?
I don't remember which one said that. I think so. So.
I'm pretty sure it was Spock. I might be wrong about
Well,
that.
Spock it would make sense because Spock, as his function in the show, was having to be very
Yeah,
blunt.
the voice of reason.
He had this. He said over and over again, "Edith Keeler must die. She must die." When he sees Kirk saving, helping her, preventing her from falling down the flight of stairs, he's like, "Captain, you're gonna have to let that go. You can't be helping her all the time. That could have. She must die. She just must die." But it's more than just a reflex of humanity for Kirk to like try to save. Oh, he's in love with this woman. But the tragedy at the end, which we'll go into in a few minutes, I think it's perfectly orchestrated.
Yeah, and it definitely made me want to have her live. Like a big part of me was like, why does this visionary have to die? And the way in which they handle that, that very, very, I would find not even fine tuned, just a very delicate.
Well, it's still
situation.
Kirk's fault. I mean, the reason she's walking back across the street is because she's curious that obviously Kirk and this McCoy Bones fella know each other and they're hugging each other. And then she's walking across the street and the truck is coming. It's about to it's about to hit her, and Bones steps out to try to save her. And it's really well written. It's not Spock who has to hold Bones back. It is Kirk. He has no choice but to hold him there, but he doesn't have the courage to. He has to close his eyes as he's holding him back, and then Bones has no idea what's going on because he's going, "Why did you do that? Do you have any idea what you've done?" And at least Spock is there to say he knows completely what he's done. It's like the tragedy is like fivefold there. It's such a harsh tragedy, but it's one that has to happen. It's so bizarre to put yourself into that situation as well.
And the fact that they were imaginative in coming up with this, because there were other, like I mentioned earlier, there are other versions where Kirk wasn't aware that Edith had to die. But then in the final release, that he was made aware, and that Spock was the kind of the arbiter of that, added to that tragedy. And I wanted to go in further and say that when Kirk was holding back McCoy, for a short moment, I was wondering who was holding back who. Because the way in which Kirk was acting at that particular moment in time, William Shatner, I mean, it almost seemed like he himself was hesitant to try and stop McCoy.
And he was bracing for an emotional impact as well.
Mm-hmm.
What a harsh ending. But that's one of the reasons why it hit so hard, because it's like a Twilight Zone episode, but it's a moral fable. Mm-hmm. It has that ironic, hard-to-swallow pill that is a staple of Twilight Zone episodes, but with this one, it's with a moral bent.
Absolutely, and we see more from Spock's analysis that the altering of events to where Edith lives and goes on to rally this peace movement is in such the wrong time, because this allows for the Nazis to develop deuterium, which is heavy water, and deuterium was helpful in nuclear proliferation, nuclear energy proliferation, and so it was a breakthrough in nuclear physics at the time. And because she wasn't made aware of that and she didn't know, her actions as a visionary to make about peace was at precisely the wrong moment in history, unfortunately, because her peace movement allowed them to develop that technology and then take over the world.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. So then, taking that, and you find that towards the end of like about in the middle, that the Enterprise no longer exists, right? You find that out in the beginning, but then you realize the impact of that the fact that the Nazis took over and destroyed everything, that this new future didn't even have a USS Enterprise. It didn't even have a Starfleet. It was completely devoid of that, and it showed that her contribution her contribution to peaceful vision actually had the opposite effect. It was counterintuitive, and instead millions more even died. And that was said by Spock again. How many millions more can die for this? And having this utilitarian lens of how important it is to favor the many over the few or even the one is not betraying of the Star Trek
Well, no, I mean,
ethos.
that's actually one
in
of
fact,
the.
it adds to it.
Well, that's a Vulcan edict. I mean,
Mhm.
Spock's last words in Wrath of Khan are needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few.
Or the one, yeah.
Or the one. That's exactly how
Exactly.
that's exactly
And
how
it does,
goes.
and it adds so much depth and beauty to the moral perspective that Gene Roddenberry is trying to add.
Well, that's
and
why
trying to
Spock
cultivate.
didn't have a confusion, didn't have a battle morality.
Mhm.
That's a more individualist or human characteristic to have. But Kirk rose to the occasion and did what he had to do, which is become a murderer, an assassin.
Right, and he did hold off on what he had done. He refrained from his action, and you could tell that was very much against Kirk's very nature, the very spirit of how he is as a person, how a lot of people are. We want to immediately, you know, have that impulsive desire to help someone else, and that we have to sometimes resist that desire, knowing that our contribution will actually cause a great amount of harm.
And that's the prime directive in a nutshell too, but in like in a romantic form, in a tragic form, but in a form that you understand, in a form that you completely understand. Shit. Now also, fuck off, First Contact and Carbon Creek. This was the first real, true first contact, right, with the Vulcans and humanity.
No, he was Chinese, remember?
Oh my god, yeah, he got that through like a rice. Oh my god, Kirk. Oh my god. Any final thoughts?
Couple, yeah, if you don't mind, if I just ramble a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I was really, we watched the enhanced version with the graphics being a little better than the original series. And I think that added to it, where you have a lot of other science fiction where it's untouched and it's an original version and it's hard to get yourself immersed. I think that added to it. It was like not only immersive, but it was grappling. It really had me.
It also wasn't incredibly
Mm-hmm.
obvious when they improved on some of the effects for the Blu-ray releases of the series. I mean, it's not like a Star Trek Redux. I mean, I'm sorry, a Star Wars Redux. It's pretty nuanced and it's not incredibly obvious to you. I think that I like the improved effects. I think it works well.
Yeah, and I also like the overall setting. Like, you can tell the setting itself was very well thought out, and that just how all of the decision-making process boiled down to this one almost innocuous action.
The aesthetic of the original series is probably one of the largest reasons why I think it's the best Star Trek series as well. I find it really just pleasing to the eye on a superficial level, but also that makes it easy to get lost in it too.
Yeah.
Feels both alien and familiar the way science fiction should feel.
Yeah, I agree.
All right. Thank you guys for watching. This was Zachary Conan and David Kay talking about the city on the edge of forever. Make sure to subscribe. Make sure to like the video. And in the comments down below, what did you guys think of this episode?
I'm going to watch it again.
You should. All right, David, let's get the hell out of here.